Alrighty, so here we are for round one, and we are on the draw after opponent wins the roll, and we are happy to be on the draw. We almost always want to be on the draw with this deck because it virtually gives you an extra card and your opponent one less card, and it really punishes their mulligans as well, which is quite possibly the most important part. If your opponent mulligans and you don't, you're pretty much going to automatically win with 8 rack a lot of the time, since their cards are so important and you're so good at picking off the important ones, and just them having a few less resources can be the difference. But we're happy with this hand. We can cast nearly everything in this hand already, and we get 2 draws at a land as well, so we're happy to keep. And our opponent keeps and leads on Aether Vial, which is a bit problematic, potentially, if we can't get rid of all the goodies in hand. So we Thoughtseize our opponent on turn 1 and see, well, we're not taking Reflector Mage, since Reflector Mage isn't doing anything against us. We don't have any creatures for it to bounce, so we're taking a Spell Queller or Aether Vial. So the argument for Spell Queller, taking Spell Queller, is that it's going to be difficult to get rid of both of those Spell Quellers, and pretty easy for our opponent to cast both of them. And Spell Queller is going to be pretty good against Smallpox as well, since our opponent can, once they get up to 3 counters on Aether Vial, they can just leave up the Aether Vial and Spell Queller, and it's basically guaranteed to get our Smallpox if our opponent is worried about Smallpox. The argument for taking Aether Vial is that if our opponent is savvy as to what's going on, which they might not be, they could just not play their land and just have an Aether Vial on 3 and Aether Vial on 2 and never play another land again and just Aether Vial us out of the game. We also have Wrench Mind, so if our opponent holds on to their Aether Vial, they can, our Wrench Mind is going to be a lot worse because they can just discard it. So I end up taking the Aether Vial. I'm not sure if that's correct, because we could potentially just find another Inquisition or Thoughtseize and get rid of both Spell Quellers before they have a chance to annoy us. But I take the Aether Vial. I'm not sure I like that decision. I would probably take the Spell Queller in retrospect and just try and run our opponent out of Spell Quellers and assume that our opponent is going to just go land Aether Vial, since, I mean, that's the obvious play, even if it's not the correct one. So Thalia is going to be a problem. So much for casting any of the spells in our hand. Fortunately, we immediately get there with Urborg. On the downside, we're casting pretty irrelevant spells when we want to be casting like Smallpox at this point. So we get Reflector Mage, opponent's ticking up, and the Thalia is causing issues. So we draw Urborg. Now we really want to cast Smallpox here. Unfortunately, it's awkward because we have to get rid of one of our Urborgs just to cast it. The issue with, say, going Wrench Mind and leaving our opponent with probably a Spell Queller is that we don't know when we'll be able to cast this Smallpox, if ever. And if we do Smallpox and get rid of the Thalia, we're going to be able to cast Wrench Mind next turn. Or, say, like Raven's Crime or something to play around Spell Quellers. I do decide to smallpox. I'm not in love with this play either, actually. It might have just been better to wrench mind and just leave our opponent with the spell queller, but both options do seem somewhat risky, because now our opponent just has 2 spell quellers that we need to deal with. And fortunately for us, our opponent puts in a Thalia immediately. If they had have kept up spell queller, we would have pretty much just instantly lost the game. But now we get the stupendous play of wrench minding our opponent. So I think both me and my opponent made some incorrect decisions this game. But fortunately, our opponent went for the daring Thalia play that did not work out great. And they also played out Aether Revolt, which is going to work out for us as well, because we happen to have double racks, which are going to easily race this Thalia by itself. And our opponent, the nice thing for our opponent is that they can keep their creature in hand and then wait for us to try and make them discard it and jump it out, but just Ghost Quarter is good for us. And now our opponent is just dead, even if we don't make them discard. But we draw a Thoughtseize, and yeah, our opponent is in fact dead. Yeah, so that was kind of a strange game. I mean, turn 1 Aether Revolt is pretty good against this deck, but I think both of us made some misplays there that worked out in my favor. So here, we're going to want disfigures for sure to deal with the Thalias. The Thalias that are good against us, not the 3/2 Thalias. Those aren't so good against us, because we don't run that many non-basics and we don't run any creatures really. So disfigures are the major one. Maybe some ensnaring bridges could potentially lock our opponent out of the game. Wrench mines do not seem that great against Aether Vial in particular, and Raven's Crime seems a little weak as well. Funeral Charm's great because it kills Thalia, but here maybe get rid of a Shrieking Affliction. Seems alright, although our opponent should be emptying their hand pretty quick, so maybe just a Raven's Crime and do that, and see if they have Artifact Destruction. If they don't, Ensnaring Bridge could just be a win. And yeah, and then on to the next game. Alright, so our opponent chooses to play first, which a lot of people do. And a lot of people don't like to draw, even though it's usually correct against this deck. So yeah, we're obviously mulliganing that hand, and our opponent keeps, and we're obviously keeping this. This is great. And we see a land on top, which we're happy to have. We want to cast Smallpox, so we're definitely just going to top that. And Explosives on 1, which is going to be somewhat annoying because it blows up Shrieking Affliction in the rack, but not that big of a deal. We can just play one, and we don't even have one in this hand, so we're fine with that. And our opponent's hand is Flickerwisp, Selfless Spirit, Collected Company, and Kira. And we decided to take the Kira because You might think we want to take Selfless Spirit because our opponent can actually cast it. They can't even cast Kira or Flicker Wisp yet, but we want to get full value off our Smallpox, and then we don't want Kira in play because we can disfigure pretty much everything else. So our opponent draws the Seachrome Coast, casts the Selfless Spirit, and we are ready to Smallpox. So here, there's an argument for discarding pretty much all of these. The rack is bad because of engineered explosives, but it does grind through this first explosives. We don't really need the rack though because we have Mutavault, although our opponent does have Ghost Quarter, but it's just a matter of what resource we want to be attacking. In retrospect, I think I like getting rid of the Thoughtseize just because the rack is... we probably have to grind through this explosives. Knowing me though, I just can't resist Thoughtseizing something immediately, but I think I should have definitely got rid of Thoughtseize there. And just got rid of the explosives essentially. Since, the deck is mostly discard spells anyways. And we draw Dismember, which is good. The nice thing is I know I'm hitting something with this Thoughtseize. The problem is, if I give my opponent enough time, they're just going to eventually draw out of it, although I do have a good amount of removal at the moment. Alright, so the Mutavault beatdown begins, and our opponent just immediately Ghost Quarters it, and we're fine with that. We basically got card advantage, which is what we want, and disfigure that. And we're obviously holding on to Smallpox since we would be the only one discarding a card there, and we for sure want to get our opponent good. And again, we're not going to bother Smallpoxing because we would discard a premium card, which we don't want to do. We would much prefer discarding Thoughtseize, which we go ahead and do. And there's Liliana, which is going to be an effective way of closing out the game. And our opponent Spellquells. I actually should have dismembered this, I think. It's just too awkward if our opponent happens to draw a second Spellqueller off the top to try and get Smallpox value. I should have definitely dismembered it though. Even though it's unlikely our opponent draws another Spellqueller, they happen to, and now we're in a super awkward spot, whereas before we were doing great. Because now we just lose our Liliana in the most awkward of ways possible. And if we hadn't have just dismembered at the worst possible time, we would have been in a much better position. Fortunately, we're drawing like a champ and just draw the rack, which is going to be great. As you can see though, I made plenty of sequencing errors. This was actually my first time playing the deck, and there goes our Dismember doing nothing. And Thalia is online. And we can't really do much against it. But Shrieking Affliction is a great draw because we're going to be able to race here pretty well. And our opponent draws Rest in Peace, which is not such a great card against us. Only really good against Raven's Crime, which we don't even like in this matchup. Our opponent probably should have not played the Rest in Peace. It would have been better as a random card in hand as well. And now we have the option to block with Blinkmoth Nexus, which is going to do a great job of blocking there. And if our opponent had have kept Rest in Peace and their land in hand, we wouldn't even be dealing them damage, and they would be presenting a very difficult clock for us to deal with. But now it's just too late for them. And we drew another Shrieking Affliction. And that's going to be it. That was more. It seemed like our opponent made some wrong decisions there. 8-rack can be tricky to play against, though, if you're unfamiliar with how the matchup goes. And it's not like we played perfectly either, but yeah, things worked out for us. We drew pretty well and got pretty lucky, I'd say.